like over here.
Mind if we look around?
No, or street road in this road.
I just can't believe he's dead. It's terrible. But I just thank God that Elvis died here at Graceland instead of on...
The embalmer looked down at Elvis's corpse under the harsh fluorescent lights of the preparation room. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and the city outside was paralyzed by grief. 2 armed state troopers stood by the door, blocking the young medical assistant from leaving. Before the embalmer could even reach for his instruments, an estate lawyer stepped forward and forced him to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The public was weeping outside, but inside this cold room, the physical evidence on the body shattered the official timeline. This is the secret they spent millions trying to bury. The 2 o'clock escort. The wheels of the heavy transport gurney squeaked against the clean linoleum floor of the Memphis funeral home. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning on August 17, 1977. The humid southern air outside was completely thick with the sound of distant police sirens and crying crowds. But inside the basement preparation room, the temperature was kept at an icy 40 degrees. The embalmer, a quiet man who had spent 30 years handling the city's most prominent families, adjusted his rubber apron. He looked down at the porcelain table, his face entirely unreadable under the buzzing fluorescent tubes. 10 minutes earlier, 2 unmarked state police cruisers had pulled into the rear loading dock. They did not use their sirens. They did not have their headlights on. 3 armed state troopers had escorted the embalmer directly from his private residence, giving him no time to call his business partner or notify his staff. As he entered the building, a security guard immediately confiscated his personal car keys and his wallet, placing them inside a sealed plastic envelope. The entire facility was being systematically locked down from the inside out, completely cut off from the standard municipal network. A young medical assistant stood by the stainless steel instrument tray, his fingers visibly shaking as he organized the arterial tubes and the chemical bottles. He had never seen the basement look like this. 2 corporate lawyers from a prominent Beverly Hills firm were already seated on folding chairs near the supply cabinets. They were not dressed for a funeral. They wore sharp, dark business suits, and each carried a leather briefcase packed with legal documents. One of the lawyers held a running stopwatch in his left hand, tracking the minutes with mathematical precision. The embalmer reached for his clipboard to begin the standard intake paperwork required by Tennessee state law. This logbook was the official record of the county used to document the physical condition of every body that passed through the facility. But before his pen could touch the paper, the senior attorney stood up and blocked his hand. The lawyer did not say a word of condolence. He simply slid a single typed document over the clipboard, completely covering the state-issued ledger. This document was an emergency non-negotiable non-disclosure agreement. The text at the top explicitly stated that any observation regarding the physical condition, internal organs, or skin markings on the tissue would be treated as a violation of federal corporate espionage laws. The lawyer informed the embalmer that if he did not sign the form within 60 seconds, the state troopers outside would immediately padlock the front doors and revoke the facility's commercial operating license before the morning banks opened. The embalmer looked at the armed guard by the door, took a deep breath, and signed his name in dark blue ink. What troubled the medical assistant was the total absence of standard hospital paperwork. When a body was transferred from a local emergency room, it was always accompanied by a triplicate health department clearance form detailing the exact time of death and the attending physician's signature. This gurney had no such paperwork. The corpse had been moved in a private utility van owned by an outside security company, completely bypassing the county coroner's office and the city's official municipal tracking system. The assistant noticed something else when he reached down to adjust the white sheet covering the torso. The standard identification tag that the hospital staff always tied to the right ankle was missing entirely. In its place was a thick red plastic security band with a stamped serial number. This band did not belong to the Memphis hospital system. The serial prefix matched a private medical center based out of state, suggesting that the body had been processed under an entirely separate institutional network hours before the official emergency room call was even placed to the city dispatcher. The corporate lawyers watched every single movement with absolute intensity. They did not look away from the porcelain table for a single second. Every time the embalmer adjusted a light or moved an instrument, The lawyer with the stopwatch made a small, handwritten notation on a yellow legal pad. The atmosphere inside the room was completely transactional, resembling an industrial product inspection rather than the preparation of a beloved global icon. The managers were not there to honor a legacy. They were there to audit a corporate asset and ensure that the physical reality of the body did not contradict the narrative they had already sold to the global press. The embalmer carefully folded back the sheet to begin the initial external examination. This was the moment where decades of professional experience took over. He looked for the standard post-mortem indicators that would allow him to calculate the exact timeline of the tragedy. The official statement issued by the family's spokesman at 4 o'clock that afternoon had claimed the singer passed away quietly in his bed around midday. But the physical condition of the tissue told an entirely different story. The deep discoloration in the lower extremities proved that the blood had begun settling in the vessels long before the ambulance was ever summoned to the mansion. The rigor in the major muscle groups was already completely fixed, a biological process that required a minimum of 8 to 10 hours to develop in a temperature-controlled environment. The embalmer calculated that the true time of death was closer to 4 o'clock in the morning, right during the hidden hours when the gate logs showed a mysterious out-of-state delivery truck entering the rear carport. The physical evidence proved that a massive domestic cover-up had been happening inside the house for nearly 12 hours before the outside world was notified. The singer had been lying cold upstairs while his managers were downstairs, organizing the corporate files, locking away the private ledgers, and securing the multi-million-dollar insurance policies. The embalmer looked up at the corporate attorney, his eyes narrowing as he realized the true scale of the deception. The lawyer met his gaze with a cold, unblinking stare. He tapped his finger against the yellow legal pad, reminding the specialist of the document he had just signed. The secret was locked inside the room, and the clock was ticking toward the public viewing. The sterile sanctuary. Under guard. The smell of concentrated formaldehyde and zinc chloride began to fill the lower level of the building by 3 o'clock in the morning. The exhaust fans in the ceiling vibrated with a low, mechanical hum that did not fully clear the heavy air. Outside the single frosted glass window, the shadows of 2 state troopers moved back and forth across the gravel driveway. They were stationed at 5-foot intervals along the entire rear perimeter, keeping their eyes on the alleyway. No local police officers were permitted near the loading dock. The entire operation was handled exclusively by the state's executive security tier. Inside the room, the 2 corporate lawyers from California did not open their mouths. They sat perfectly still on their metal stools, watching the embalmer prepare the primary fluid pumps. The senior attorney, whose name was listed on the Beverly Hills firm's letterhead as a senior partner, kept his leather briefcase balanced on his knees. Every time the embalmer stepped away from the table to retrieve an instrument from the glass cabinets, the attorney leaned forward to inspect the specific tool before it was used on the tissue. The embalmer reached for a standard, leather-bound funeral home intake ledger that sat on the corner desk. This ledger was the business's internal diary, used for over half a century, to document the name, date, and basic physical observations of every individual processed by the firm. The state laws required that these entries be made in chronological order, with no skipped lines or erased sections. The embalmer uncapped his fountain pen, intending to enter the standard operational data for the evening. The senior lawyer stood up immediately, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the wet concrete floor. He did not ask for the ledger. He reached across the desk and physically pressed the book shut with his hand. He looked the embalmer directly in the eye and stated that this specific entry would not be written in the standard house book. He pulled a separate unbound sheet of heavy parchment paper from his briefcase and laid it on the desk. The page was marked with an official corporate seal from a holding company registered in Wilmington, Delaware. The lawyer told the embalmer that this private sheet would serve as the only legal intake record for the evening. The document omitted the standard state health department fields, such as the estimated time of death and the list of present witnesses. Instead, it contained a pre-written statement certifying that the body was received in a completely standard, unmodified condition from the hospital morgue. The embalmer was ordered to sign the bottom of this private sheet and leave the corresponding line in the permanent leather ledger entirely blank. This action created an immediate, massive legal violation for the funeral home. To leave a blank line in a state-regulated intake book was a misdemeanor offense that could result in the immediate closure of the business. The embalmer pointed this out, his voice echoing slightly in the cold room. The lawyer did not argue the point. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a signed administrative order from the state health commissioner's office in Nashville. The order explicitly exempted the funeral home from standard record-keeping procedures for the next 72 hours, citing matters of executive security. Another question that instantly troubled the young medical assistant was why a prominent corporate entity would go to such extreme lengths to bypass a simple city registry. He realized that if a researcher or a local journalist examined the permanent leather ledger years down the road, there would be no physical record that the global icon had ever passed through the building. The paper trail was being split into two distinct realities, a public version that followed the official press releases, and a private corporate version that was locked away inside a California briefcase. The isolation of the workspace was absolute. At 3:30, the internal intercom system on the wall began to buzz. It was the night watchman at the front desk, trying to relay a message from a local coroner's investigator who had arrived at the outer gate. The investigator was requesting entry to perform a routine verification of the body's identity for the city death certificate. The senior lawyer did not let the embalmer answer the call. He walked to the wall panel, reached down, and physically yanked the copper wiring out of the back of the intercom unit, cutting off the front desk entirely. The room had become a completely sovereign territory, ruled exclusively by the interests of the estate's underwriters. The young assistant watched from the corner as the second lawyer began organizing a stack of pre-printed medical certificates. These certificates were already stamped with the signature of a physician who had not entered the building that night. The fields for the official cause of death were left blank, waiting for a specific corporate-approved phrase to be filled in once the public viewing arrangements were finalized upstairs. The clinical sanctuary had been entirely transformed into an administrative processing center, where the physical evidence of the body was systematically subordinated to the needs of a multi-million-dollar entertainment monopoly. The mark on the left arm. The embalmer adjusted the overhead surgical lamp, tilting the wide aluminum shade to concentrate the light directly onto the inner aspect of the corpse's left forearm. The brilliant illumination washed out the gray skin tones, exposing every minute variation on the surface of the tissue. The young medical assistant stepped closer, holding a bottle of topical antiseptic. He stopped completely still when his eyes adjusted to the focused beam. Directly over the median cubital vein, where the skin was usually smooth, sat a deep purple discoloration roughly the size of a silver dollar. It was not the standard post-mortem mottling that occurs naturally after circulation ceases. This was a localized, violent hematoma, a massive pooling of blood beneath the dermal layers that could only happen while a human heart was still actively pumping with significant force. In the dead center of this dark circle was a clear, clean puncture mark from a heavy-gauge clinical needle. The presence of this fresh wound completely contradicted the preliminary medical examiner's report that had been read to the television networks at midnight. That report had explicitly stated that there were no signs of physical trauma, external injury, or recent medical injections on the body when it was examined at the hospital. Yet, the embalmer could see with absolute certainty that this puncture was less than 24 hours old. The edges of the wound were completely free of the cellular healing process that begins within a few hours of a standard clinical treatment. The senior corporate lawyer stood up from his stool instantly, his dark shadow falling across the porcelain table as he leaned forward to inspect the arm. He did not ask the embalmer for an opinion. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a small pocket camera with an attached electronic flash, and took 3 close-up photographs of the wound. He then reached down and grabbed a sterile gauze pad from the instrument tray. Using a bottle of heavy solvent to scrub the skin around the puncture site, attempting to clear away any chemical residue before the embalming fluids could react with the tissue. The embalmer pointed toward the deep color of the bruise, explaining that an injection of this size, given shortly before death, indicated a massive emergency clinical intervention. It was the type of mark left behind when an out-of-state medical specialist attempts to deliver high doses of cardiac stimulants directly into the central venous system during an acute physical collapse. This was not a routine prescription delivery. It was a desperate last-minute attempt to stabilize a failing system under extreme duress. Now, if the singer had passed away quietly in his bed around midday, as the family spokesman insisted, who was administering heavy-gauge intravenous injections to his left arm during the early morning hours, the mark proved that a medical practitioner was present in that upstairs suite long before the local fire department ambulance was ever summoned to the property. Someone had been actively managing a profound medical crisis in total secrecy while the rest of the city slept. The lawyer finished scrubbing the skin and turned back to his briefcase. He pulled out a small blue plastic identification card that had been issued by an experimental pharmaceutical research clinic located in Scottsdale, Arizona. The card was registered under a corporate account name, with the individual user field left entirely blank. He laid the card on the clipboard next to the embalmer's hands and stated quietly that this specific injury was to be listed in the preparation notes as a standard post-mortem artifact caused by the emergency room staff during their initial resuscitation attempts. The embalmer refused to make the entry. He knew that the hospital paramedics always use the larger veins in the right arm or the central jugular lines during a standard cardiac arrest protocol, precisely to avoid the difficult, collapsed vessels of the lower limbs. To attribute this deep, localized hematoma to a frantic emergency room was a transparent fabrication that any independent forensic pathologist would see through instantly during an autopsy. The mark on the left arm was a signature left behind by a private clinician who had fled the scene before the local authorities arrived. The lawyer did not argue with the specialist's assessment. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a second, sealed document. This was a direct, formal waiver from the county probate court, signed by an administrative judge at 11 o'clock that evening. The waiver officially granted the estate management team the legal right to bypass the standard state medical examiner's autopsy protocol, citing the family's right to immediate religious and privacy protections. The legal system had been completely re-engineered in the dark to ensure that no independent doctor would ever examine that left arm under a microscope. The embalmer was completely trapped by the paperwork, forced to proceed with the preservation process while the definitive proof of the midnight crisis was systematically erased by the chemical pumps. Discrepancies in the heavy ledger. The brass scale on the wall of the preparation room was an industrial model calibrated twice a year by the State Weights and Measures Division. It was a cold, functional tool that didn't care about celebrity or legacy. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the embalmer recorded the physical metrics of the corpse onto a loose sheet of scrap paper using the heavy black pencil he kept behind his ear. The numbers he recorded created an immediate, glaring discrepancy with the preliminary press release that was already being printed for the morning editions of the local newspapers. The official statement from the estate's public relations office had described the singer as weighing roughly 250 pounds at the time of his passing, attributing his recent physical difficulties to a mild case of water retention and exhaustion. But the actual physical reality on the scale was far more shocking. The beam balanced at 342 pounds. The severe weight gain was not a sudden development. The tissue showed clear signs of chronic, long-term metabolic failure and massive internal edema that had been completely hidden from the public by the clever tailoring of his stage capes. The embalmer reached for the heavy ledger book that sat on the wooden desk, intending to copy these accurate figures into the permanent city registry. Every funeral home in Memphis was required to maintain this specific book, which was audited monthly by the county health department to ensure that the physical statistics on the death certificates matched the actual intake logs of the licensed morticians. To enter a false weight or height was a straight violation of the state's public health code, carrying a mandatory suspension of the facility's operating credentials. The younger corporate attorney stepped toward the desk before the pencil could hit the paper. He did not say a word. He pulled a heavy bottle of black industrial ink eraser from his briefcase and set it directly on top of the ledger pages. He then pointed to a specific line in his own type portfolio, which listed the singer's weight as exactly 210 pounds. The ideal weight recorded on his California driver's license from 1972. The lawyer told the embalmer that this was the only number that would be permitted to enter the official tracking system. Why was the management team so utterly terrified of the true weight being recorded in a private city ledger? This question troubled the embalmer a lot. He realized that the discrepancy had nothing to do with vanity or public image. It was a matter of high-stakes corporate insurance. The estate had recently secured a massive $25 million non-appearance bond from a European underwriting syndicate to cover the financial liabilities of the upcoming autumn tour. One of the strict medical clauses in that insurance policy stated that if the artist's weight exceeded 300 pounds due to a chronic, untreated metabolic condition, the entire policy would be rendered completely null and void in the event of a cancellation or death. If the true weight of 342 pounds was written into the heavy ledger, the European underwriters would have immediate legal grounds to refuse the multi-million-dollar payout, leaving the corporate management firm entirely liable for the millions of dollars in non-refundable stadium ticket sales. The embalmer looked down at the black ink eraser bottle on his desk. He knew that if he complied with the lawyer's instruction, he was participating in an active case of corporate insurance fraud that could land him in a federal penitentiary. But the older lawyer stepped forward, leaning his hands flat on the desk. He stated plainly that the original intake line would be left entirely blank for 48 hours, during which time a special administrative courier from the governor's office would arrive to personally take custody of the heavy ledger. The corporate team was not just asking for a simple alteration. They were systematically removing the entire book from the jurisdiction of the local county clerks, ensuring that the true physical metrics of the king would remain buried forever behind a wall of executive privilege. The midnight phone call from California. The black rotary telephone on the wall of the embalmer's private office began to ring at exactly 4:30 in the morning. The sound was sharp and intrusive, cutting through the heavy hum of the basement ventilation system. The embalmer wiped his hands on a clean cotton towel, stepped out of the preparation room, and closed the heavy oak door behind him. The corporate lawyers stayed inside the clinical workspace, their eyes glued to the porcelain table, where the assistant was finishing the primary arterial rinsing. The line was completely clear, free of the static typical of long-distance connections from the West Coast. The man on the other end did not identify himself by name. He didn't need to. The voice was instantly recognizable. It was the raspy, slow cadence of Colonel Tom Parker's chief financial officer, speaking directly from a private hotel suite in Beverly Hills. He did not waste time with formal greetings or expressions of personal grief. He asked a single question, demanding to know if the non-disclosure agreements had been fully executed by the staff. The embalmer confirmed that the signatures were on the paperwork. The financial officer did not congratulate him. Instead, he laid out the terms of a new, highly specific commercial arrangement. He informed the funeral home director that a primary retention contract had just been drafted by the estate's central corporate office. The contract guaranteed the facility an exclusive, lifetime monthly retainer fee of $8,000, extended over a 20-year period. In exchange for this guaranteed revenue stream, the funeral home was required to transfer absolute ownership of all internal intake notes, chemical logs, and physical measurement sheets to the California firm. This offer was not an act of corporate generosity. It was a massive financial buyout, disguised as a standard professional service contract. The $8,000 a month represented far more than the business's entire annual profit margin from its regular municipal operations. The corporate team was actively purchasing the permanent silence of the only independent specialists in the state who had touched the physical evidence. They needed to ensure that no future legislative investigation or insurance audit could ever compel the embalmer to testify about what he had seen under the surgical lamps. The embalmer looked through the small glass window of his office door, watching the two lawyers inside the preparation room. He asked what would happen if he chose to decline the retention contract and file his standard report with the county health department. The voice on the telephone instantly lost its polite commercial tone. The financial officer stated coldly that a secondary legal team was already standing by at the federal courthouse in Nashville. If the funeral home refused to cooperate, the estate's insurers would file an immediate emergency injunction, accusing the embalmer of gross professional misconduct and the unauthorized theft of private corporate properties. The financial officer openly admitted that 3 international auditing representatives from the London underwriting syndicate had arrived at the California headquarters at midnight. They were demanding to see the physical verification reports before authorizing the immediate release of the $25 million non-appearance bond. If a single detail regarding the unrecorded medical injections or the true physical weight leaked to the financial press before the opening of the New York Stock Exchange, the policy would be frozen indefinitely, triggering an immediate corporate bankruptcy for the management firm. The intimidation was systematic, calculated, and backed by unlimited financial resources. The embalmer realized that his small, family-owned business was completely helpless against the legal machinery of a global entertainment monopoly. He was being forced to make a definitive choice between his professional ethics and the absolute financial survival of his family. The voice on the phone told him that the physical copies of the retention contract would be delivered to his front desk by an armed courier at 6 o'clock, leaving him exactly 90 minutes to finalize his decision before the morning press corps arrived at the perimeter. The embalmer hung up the receiver, his hand lingering on the cold plastic of the phone. He felt a profound sense of isolation. The city outside was preparing for a massive, historic funeral, entirely unaware that the true narrative of the tragedy was being bartered away over a long-distance telephone line while the body was still cold on the table. He walked back into the preparation room, his boots clicking softly on the floor. The senior attorney looked up from his yellow legal pad, his face completely expressionless. He didn't ask about the phone call. He simply gestured toward the desk, where the loose scrap paper with the true physical metrics was sitting, waiting to see if the specialist would destroy the evidence or risk total professional ruin. The missing wardrobe mystery. The delivery truck from the estate's private tailoring shop arrived at the side entrance of the funeral home at 5 o'clock in the morning. The sky was just beginning to turn a pale metallic blue over the city, but the alleyway remained dark. A local domestic worker who had served as the singer's personal wardrobe assistant at the mansion for nearly a decade stepped out of the vehicle. She was carrying a long, zippered garment bag made of heavy black canvas. 2 corporate security guards escorted her from the truck directly down to the basement preparation room, never leaving her side for a single second. The garment bag contained the specific wardrobe chosen by the estate management team for the upcoming open casket public viewing. The public expected to see their icon dressed in one of his legendary stage outfits, or at least a formal tuxedo that matched his legendary public image. But when the embalmer unzipped the canvas bag, he found a completely standard dark-colored business suit with an unusually high, rigid white collar. The fabric was stiff, heavily starched, and completely modified from its original commercial design. The embalmer lifted the suit jacket from the hanger to prepare the body for dressing. He instantly noticed that the back of the white collar had been systematically altered by a seamstress. A wide strip of industrial Velcro and 2 heavy-gauge metal stays had been sewn directly into the lining of the fabric. This modification was not an aesthetic choice. It was designed to force the garment to stand completely upright against the back of the neck, creating an absolute physical barrier that would prevent anyone looking into the casket from seeing the tissue behind the ears or along the upper cervical spine. The question that immediately puzzled the young medical assistant was why the corporate handlers were so desperate to conceal the back of the neck during a standard, front-facing public viewing. He realized the answer when the wardrobe assistant stepped forward to help adjust the shoulders of the jacket. As the security guards turned their backs to inspect the door frame, the woman reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a small, folded piece of brown butcher paper, and quietly slipped it directly into the embalmer's apron pocket. She gave him a brief, terrified look before stepping away from the porcelain table. The embalmer waited until the lawyers were occupied with a fresh stack of shipping manifests near the supply cabinets. He stepped into the adjacent restroom, pulled the paper from his pocket, and unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note from the mansion's head housekeeper, along with a small plastic cap that had been salvaged from a specialized medical device used in neurological clinics. The note stated plainly that the singer had been fitted with an experimental, subcutaneous drug delivery pump in his upper neck just 3 weeks prior to his death. The device had been installed by the out-of-state medical specialist during one of the midnight visits that the gate logs had omitted. It was designed to automatically deliver high doses of stimulants directly into the spinal column to keep the performer active during his grueling rehearsal schedule. When the singer collapsed in the early morning hours, the private clinician had frantically attempted to surgically remove the device before the local ambulance arrived, leaving a jagged, unstitched incision along the base of the skull. The missing wardrobe mystery was now completely solved. The high, rigid white collar with the internal metal stays was not chosen for its style. It was a calculated piece of theatrical engineering designed to hide the evidence of a highly illegal, unrecorded surgical procedure from the thousands of fans who would be walking past the open casket later that afternoon. The estate management team could not risk a single sharp-eyed attendee or a local reporter noticing the fresh surgical scars on the neck, which would have triggered an immediate mandatory investigation by the State Board of Medical Examiners. The embalmer carefully refolded the note, placed it back into his pocket, and walked back out to the table to dress the body, realizing that every single layer of clothing was being used to seal a multi-million-dollar corporate secret. The ultimate price of the secret. The sun was fully up by 6 o'clock in the morning, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete floor of the basement. The embalming process was finished. The tools were back in their glass cases, and the porcelain table had been scrubbed clean with industrial disinfectant. The senior corporate lawyer stood by the door, holding the leather briefcase that now contained every scrap of paper generated during the night. Before leaving, he reached out and took the small pocket camera he had used to photograph the puncture marks on the left arm. He pulled the film cartridge directly out of the housing, exposing the delicate negatives to the bright morning light, completely destroying the visual evidence. For the embalmer, the true cost of that night began to accumulate the moment those iron doors reopened to the public. He did not sign the lifetime retention contract that the Beverly Hills firm had offered over the telephone. He could not bring himself to accept the $8,000 a month, viewing it as a permanent shackle that would turn his family business into a subsidiary of the California holding company. But his refusal did not buy him freedom. It made him a permanent target for a system that could not afford a single loose thread in its narrative. Within 48 hours of the funeral, 2 investigators from the state licensing board arrived at the facility without prior notice. They did not come to review standard health certificates. They spent 3 days going through the company's tax files, its chemical purchasing receipts, and its historical employment records. They were looking for any technical violation that could be used to shut down the business or force the embalmer into a corporate settlement. Every time he opened his front door, he saw an unmarked sedan parked across the street, its occupant tracking his movements with a clipboard. The young medical assistant could not handle the intense pressure. He left his position at the funeral home less than a week after the tragedy, moving out of the state to a small town in East Texas under his mother's maiden name. He never worked in the medical or mortuary field again. Before he left, he met the embalmer one final time at a diner near the state line. He confessed that 2 men in dark suits had visited his apartment at midnight, warning him that if he ever mentioned the red plastic security band on the ankle or the high collar on the suit, his university credits would be permanently revoked by the board. The systematic disappearance of the physical evidence happened with mathematical efficiency. The loose sheet of scrap paper that held the true weight of 342 pounds was never found by the local county auditors. The heavy leather ledger book, which had been left with a blank line for 48 hours, was officially replaced by a new, rebound edition delivered directly from the state printer in Nashville. The original version of the book, which had recorded 50 years of local history, was reportedly destroyed in an accidental fire at the health department's regional archive office that winter. The embalmer kept his silence for 40 years. He watched as the television networks broadcast endless documentaries about the tragedy, each repeating the exact same corporate-approved timeline that had been drafted in his basement office. He listened to independent authors debate the medical details, knowing that the primary documents had been shredded before the first news truck ever arrived at the property. The secret became a heavy physical burden that isolated him from his peers in the industry. He could not attend professional conferences or participate in local historical societies without the fear that a casual question would violate the non-disclosure agreement he had been forced to sign under guard. A cache of private letters from the lead corporate promoter was leaked during an estate liquidation in 24. Among the papers was a confidential memo dated September of 1977, confirming that the European underwriting syndicate had paid out the $25 million non-appearance bond in full. The memo explicitly praised the legal team for their rapid containment of the physical logistics in Memphis, noting that the lack of an independent forensic autopsy had saved the firm from an immediate multi-million-dollar fraud litigation. The newly uncovered testimony from the embalmer finally exposes who controlled the physical evidence from the very first hour. The high collar, the missing logbooks, and the midnight police escort were not measures to protect a family's grief. They were the cold mechanics of an insurance salvage operation that valued a corporate payout far more than the truth of a human life. The truth of what happened in that cold preparation room was locked away to protect a $25 million corporate payout. The high collar, the missing ledger lines, and the bruised left arm proved that the handlers controlled the body from the very first hour. Do you think the embalmer did the right thing by keeping this secret for 40 years to protect his family? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. For more uncensored deep dives into historic cover-ups and royal-style drama, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. We will see you in the next video.